Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's Senza Fili Sparring Partners webinar, Spectrum for the Enterprise, the Role of Regulation. This webinar is in partnership with Forum Global's Global Spectrum Series 2022, the conference which will be held in Brussels, June 8th through 9th. And we would like to encourage our audience to check out the conference as well. Our speakers today are Eric Fournier, Director of Spectrum Planning and International Affairs at ANFR, former FCC Commissioner Mike O'Reilly, President of MPORielly Consulting, and Monica Paolini, Principal at Senza Fili. I'm Kendra Chamberlain, and I will be moderating our webinar today. In Sparring Partners webinars, we watch our speakers debate a topic live on video. We would like to encourage our audience to participate in the conversation. Please share your comments and questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Our speakers will do their best to address questions as they go along and as they become relevant to the topics being discussed. So please do not hold your questions until the end. And as all comments are visible to all participants, please keep the conversation polite and respectful. And a quick tip, please do not share your comments through the chat function, as our panelists do not monitor the chat, and we want to make sure that they see what you have to say. So feel free to include your comments in the Q&A button. And with that, I'll hand it over to Monica.
Kendra, thanks so much for the introduction. As always, it's a pleasure to be on Sparring Partners. And this particularly has to be talking about regulation. It's one of those topics where I didn't used to do much work, but it's kind of like testing. I thought it was a somewhat boring topic, but it really isn't. And yesterday I was on a panel and someone said spectrum is everything. And when you think about it, it really is. If you don't have spectrum, you're not going anywhere. No matter how great the technology is, you need spectrum. It's so fundamental. And what's happening in regulation is actually quite exciting in terms of, going beyond the basic license for operators or for military and other entities. So this is all very exciting. And today we're going to talk about what's happening in terms of spectrum for the enterprise. And we're going to look not just at what's happening in the US or Europe, we look at both, and we're going to look into other markets as well. And just as a sort of anticipate that we're going to actually have sparring partners for the Middle East and then hopefully other regions as well, because we often tend to concentrate so much into what's happening in our backyard, and it's interesting to see what other countries do as well. Now, let's get started, and I have two great speakers with me today, Monica Paolini and Eric Fournier, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves. Most of you, the aficionados of Sparring Partners already know Mike has been on Sparring Partners before, so I'm going to ask Eric to introduce himself first, and then we'll go to Mike. So Eric, welcome, and tell us who you are and what you do.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you also, Kendra. Good day to everybody. So, as mentioned by Kendra, I'm first Spectrum Manager in ANFR in France, dealing with all the international spectrum. It's always about international domain. I'm also the chairman of RSPG, which is the group of member states advising the European Commission on strategic issues in the domain of spectrum, so that will enable me to speak more generally about the situation in Europe. This group is, for example, the one which has first advised the commissions to acknowledge the need for some harmonization for 5G vertical in the and in particular for studying the 3.8 4.2 gigahertz band for local area 5G vertical authorization. So I'm pleased to have this discussion with Mike. We know each other since WRC 15, and Europe is always looking with a lot of interest on what USA is doing. If we are not taking everything from the other side of Atlantics, we are at least trying to take the best.
And Eric and I will be in Brussels, so if any of you wants to meet us, or well, I cannot talk for Eric, talk for myself. Anyway, Mike, how about you?
Well, it's a pleasure to be back. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining. I'm Mike O'Reilly. I have a private consulting firm for the last year and a half. Prior to that, I spent 7 years as an FCC commissioner, focusing on a bunch of issues, but certainly spectrum was a priority, and international issues. And as Eric mentioned, went to WRC 15 to 19. And my bulk of my career is a staffer in our legislative process in both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Working on telecommunications issues and leadership issues that flowed through my career. So this has been a passion of mine for so many years. Spectrum, as Monica mentions, is so integral to all of the discussions. I consider it kind of like the flour of baking, right? Try to bake a cake or try to make anything, in the baking universe without flour, and that's kind of where I find that you could do some things, but not very well. So, thanks so much for everyone for being here.
It's a good metaphor, and Mike did a lot of work on CBRS. So it's always a pleasure to have Mike on Sparring Partners, but in this case, it's particularly relevant because not everything, the good and bad about CBRS, he can tell us all about it. Good. So we're talking about spectrum for the enterprise. That's relatively well. I would say it's a new topic. We're talking in a new way, but obviously the enterprise have always had some spectrum that they could use, but it used to be more like a narrow band in some, weird part of the spectrum. And now we're talking about the need for the enterprise, which is much different in terms of they need much more bandwidth, not just a small channel for signaling of sorts. How do you fit it with the fact that there's just so much spectrum? Should the enterprise get spectrum allocation specifically for the enterprise, or should it just use licensed spectrum and manage that with the operators? So, Sparring Partners, we don't do presentations, but what I would like to do is to ask both Eric and Mike to just give us an introduction on what's going on in Europe and in the US in terms of what's going on, and then we can take it from there. And obviously we're going to get all the questions from you guys in the audience, so ask your questions sooner rather than later because we don't have a Q&A at the end. So Eric, why don't you get started, tell us what's going on in Europe?
Yes, well, first to respond to your question, it's very clear that MNO will be key players in meeting the requirement of 5G of verticals, industry and other. They will bring some solutions, and 5G will help them with network slicing in particular. But what is recognized now is that you may have some specific need for some verticals, which needs to have very local coverage, specific reliability conditions, long-term availability, some specific device. And for that, you may, in certain cases, need to have some local authorization. That's something which has been recognized in Europe. I would say progressively. First, some countries like Germany and Sweden, for example, open part of the 5G spectrum, the 3438, so part of this spectrum, in fact, it was 3738, for local coverage verticals in this 100 megahertz. In France, we didn't have the possibility to have this spectrum made available because we had some fixed wireless access already in the lower part of the band. I will not enter into detail. We had some solutions in the center band of the 2.6 gigahertz instead. Some other European countries use the 2.3 gigahertz, but all that is a kind of piecemeals, which is not really complying with the harmonization requirement of vertical. That's the reason why our SPG requested the European Commission member state to study the possibility to open 384.2 for this local coverage in Europe. Studies will be until 2024. We expect really positive outcome of this activity. And for France in particular, we have already started to open 3.8 to 4 gigahertz, so 200 megahertz in sharing with receiving a station in this frequency band. for experimenting these local authorizations for verticals in this frequency band.
Excellent. So it's a licensing that is somewhat similar to CBRS, but doesn't have as much of the complexity, and it's not vertical specific. Which is in the past we used to have more vertical specific allocations, and this would be for anybody. And in fact, it's not just the enterprise; it could be other entities.
It is for any entity that's clear, but it's targeting really say vertical market. And you are correct, it's less complex than CBRS, but of course Mike will explain CBRS. The sharing is really only static sharing with stations, and that's much more simple from an administration point of view.
Yeah, but it's interesting because it opens the access to spectrum to a different set of users than traditional. So Mike, what about the US?
Well, I would agree with your point in terms of we used to have a segmented frequency allocation for enterprise, the industrial channels, usually in the lower frequencies, and we've moved away from that. That model, people say, oh, we're going to have more spectrum for enterprise. And the answer in my mind is no. Will we have spectrum that can be used by enterprise? Can they obtain licenses? I think the answer is going to remain yes. It's going to be different bands and different use cases, I imagine. CBRS is the most prominent one talked about today in the United States for the sharing mechanism, where you have smaller licenses based on county, and you can ease into the marketplace, whether it's on unlicensed or hybrid with the PAL. By priority access license. But I think you're going to see other opportunities, whether it be in lower 37 or something in the lower 3 gigahertz, 3.1 to 3.45, where you could see the same kind of mechanism. It may not be as complex as CBRS, but it could be something along those lines that will provide smaller licenses for enterprise to potentially obtain the security they need, or the features that can be provided with the license, the certainty that they need. So I think the answer is, is the United States is moving in the right direction. It's not focused to, there's still the bigger fights in terms of licensed or unlicensed. We're still trying to bring more spectrum available. It's certainly the mid bands for 5G. Services for licensed. We have done considerable work. I spent a ton of time on the license bands in 6 gigahertz and 5.9. So I think as we go forward, you're going to see a mixture of all of those. Some for sharing, many more for license, and there'll still be an unlicensed conversation to be had, depending on the band and the circumstances.
Yes, and I guess the issue is to have. We obviously need a mix. The question is, what's the right mix, and what's the balance? Now, I see that there is a question, and I think that we should take that right away, because it's kind of fundamental. And then maybe we can talk a little bit more about CBRS, and then we can move over, because that's not just share spectrum and CBRS. There is more to this. But the question from Mark is about the licensing process for verticals in Germany and France. What's the cost, timelines, duration of license, geographic scope? And maybe you can comment on, because in the UK, there is also a similar framework, which is fundamentally different from US, where you have licensed and unlicensed, or licensed and lightly licensed, I should say. But so in Europe, you tend to have a local licensing that it's not multi-tiered, but anyway, Eric, can you tell us? And how expensive is it? Is it something that it's going to be something that is going to be so expensive for the enterprise that they say, well, we're not going to do it, it's too expensive?
The issue of cost is really critical. In fact, for France, in the 2.6 gigahertz that I mentioned was available for some years already, the cost was more or less aligned on the cost of spectrum for MNO. And that was something I identify as a difficulty for vertical to really access to this spectrum. We had a report which was released to the government a few weeks ago, beginning of March, in fact. And this report has really advised the government to lower the price for this access to the 2.6 gigahertz, and that would also apply for sure to the 3.8 to 4 gigahertz. So the cost was a problem in France, and that will be addressed in the next few months. Germany, I'm not totally sure about Sweden, but I'm sure it's the same. Germany and Sweden were much more cautious on the cost of license for vertical in order to encourage the use of this local vertical authorization. The timelines for grant, it's typically 10 years in the 2.6 gigahertz for France. For the 384, we just have one transition issue, which is that we will have to use the harmonized conditions after 2024. So it's a kind of experimental license until for 3 years, so until 2024, 2025, and then we will move towards the harmonized conditions. Typically in France, the authorizations for, say, PMR are for 10 years. So geographic scope is quite flexible, and that's the same in my understanding in Germany. For example, in the 2.6 gigahertz, you can have some authorizations for airports like Orly or Roissy in France, which is quite extended. And also some authorizations which are really limited to one small site indoor. So that's a large possibility of extension for the geographic scope.
Now that's something that I'm going to ask. I would like to hear what Mike thinks as well, but maybe you can talk about it first. When you talk about, it's very interesting that you can have a local license instead of a, say, national license or a wide area license, but then you have a lot of situations where you have two different license holders next to each other, and you can imagine a situation where they might be on separate floors on the same building, or so you have more situations where you need to manage interference or access, I should say, at the border. Is that an issue? I mean, maybe it's not an issue yet, but then if it becomes successful, then it becomes it could become a real issue, right?
It is an issue. You have this synchronization problem, and that may not be only among vertical. That may be also in particular for the 3842 with the adjacent MNO, which have a general coverage. So this issue, which is related to synchronization among 5G networks, is a difficulty. Among verticals, the solution that we had, for example, for the 2.6 gigahertz was to have some low level PFD limit at the border, and Germany did the same. So it's just defining the coverage with the PFD, which at the border is sufficiently limited to avoid any impact to any neighboring license.
Yeah, Mike, what do you think about that? You think it's going to work?
I'm skeptical. I've heard this approach before. When I first entered the conversation on CBRS, and I didn't start it. It was before I got to the commission, pretty much. But when I jumped into the leadership role on it, and we had a proposal on census blocks, smaller license and timelines. There was much shorter license lag, and how long you could renew and things of that nature. And I'm suspected that the managing of that long, in the near term is going to be very functional. In the longer term, I'm confident we can move in that direction. As more people become comfortable with AFCs, that I'm a big proponent of, I think that is definitely, in the future, we can move in that direction. We have some of that in the TV white spaces today. So I think there is long-term moving in that direction, but in the short term, I'm skeptical that you're going to get such a prime location that the rest of Europe is using or seems to be. I'm skeptical it's going to be very helpful.
But do you think that well, maybe you can say what the AFC is, and so in the US we have the AFC 6 gigahertz and then the SAS 3.5. Do you think? I mean, clearly they address the issue of neighboring license or neighboring users, but clearly they add complexity. So it's a kind of a trade-off. So.
Yeah, I think it's a trade-off, but it's an acceptable, as we become more comfortable, as we maneuver this process over time, I think you can make that, and they'll become, AFCs will become more dynamic. and they'll be more capable, and people will trust them more. In the short term, I think we're going to be in a very awkward spot. And I think that's different than like 3.5, where you had two dedicated systems. You got your SASs, and you got the ASCs, and so I think you've got a little bit of a twist there, and things are, you've got lower power to deal with, and I think the CBRS model right now is people say, well, where is CBRS? And I think it's in a pretty good place today in the United States, but it has so much further to go. And some of that is dealing with power limits. Some of it's dealing with, learning more off of what's happened already. There are a number of use cases or verticals that have taken off, and that's great. There's still some that we're expecting to go forward in the future. So it's kind of a mixed story, and a relatively positive one at that.
Yeah, so can you tell the audience what is the SAS and the AFC? What's the difference?
Yeah, one deals with protecting the 3 tiers of spectrum users in the 3.55 to 3.7, the CBRS spectrum location. There's 3 users. You got federal government users who are protected. That's Navy radar. I'm not sharing any secret. That's well known. They're basically on the coasts. Turn on only when bad things are going to happen. Or testing in certain circumstances, and that that's where you have the system to make sure that they are fully protected. And then you have the PALs, or the Priority Access License level 2, and those where you have what we just talked about, smaller licenses down to county level, not nationwide, down to county level. Have longer licenses timeline than originally we talked about. 10-year licenses can be renewed. We found that you couldn't get an ecosystem. The manufacturers weren't comfortable, weren't willing to build and manufacture without certain certainties that the different operators would take advantage of CBRS. And then the third tier is GAA. Basically, it's an unlicensed leg structure, and you've got use or lose it. So if you're a PAL and you're not using it, the unlicensed community can use it. But at minimum, there's 80 megahertz dedicated for GAA for that purpose. So and that's where the systems take over to make sure that you can bounce from you bounce users as needed as things get turned on. So as a PAL gets turned on, the AFC recognizes it. And make sure that it is addressed, and therefore, the unlicensed community or the GAA is turned off in that universe in certain channels. If the federal government users are turned on, if the Navy turns on its radar, then the PALs and the GAA get bounced depending on the circumstances. So that's a little bit simplistic, I recognize. And I apologize for those that have followed this for the livelihood, but it is the best I can do in this time frame to kind of give you a snapshot of where CBRS is going. Now, I think, in fairness, where are we going in the future? You're probably going to get a less complex mechanism as we learn more and federal government users become more confident with the overall system. We have sharing today. I mean, I would argue that all unlicensed is sharing, right? 6 gigahertz, we're putting unlicensed on top of or underneath, depending on your viewpoint, existing users. Some of those existing users are not happy. They didn't like the decision and sought court action and lost, including the energy companies that have certain microwave licenses. So anyway, sharing has been part of the long-standing future and will continue to be, going forward. I think what you're talking about is a much more addressable sharing mechanism, a much more defined one using technology, databases, and sensing to try and make sure that everyone is protected.
Yeah, and I think it is an important issue that today we think about spectrum sharing with the specific arrangements like CBRS or the AFC in the 6 gigahertz, but really the ultimate spectrum sharing is unlicensed. And in that respect, spectrum sharing is nothing new. And in fact, there has been sharing throughout. So it's new. What is new is the fact that you can do it on a more dynamic basic. So it's like in the time domain and in the space domain, which we can do it much more easily. But I guess that the question there is, at some point, the complexity you add is something that it's necessary or not. And so I think that the principle of the dynamic spectrum sharing is like introduce as much complexity as you really need, not too much. So that I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. And with CBRS, and like we talked about it a lot of times, I mean, there was a question of having incumbent users that they had to, not only you have to guarantee access to them, but they also need to feel comfortable that they will have access that they need. So you need to kind of deal with them.
Yeah.
And that's what you have to do, right? So in the 6 gigahertz, obviously that was an issue too, that we had to do that. And in the US, we went the AFC route for outdoor, but not for indoors. Indoor low power, you don't need it. Now, Eric, what is the status in Europe? That's a little bit more of a work in progress, right? Are you going to have an EFC type of thing, or what's happening? I mean, for the upper
Thank you.
band. Maybe you can give us that. Yeah.
I can see the same questions on the Q&A. So first to say, well, in Europe, the message is the same. We want to have more sharing, and sharing already exists, but we want to make it more dynamic, and that's the ambition. So we are very modest. I don't think we will start with something like CBRS with 3 tiers. We will only have 2 at least for the beginning. We try to launch from the French side, and I think that will come up in the next few months. The idea of an AFC in the 6 gigahertz, so for Europe, this is a lower 6 gigahertz, the radio LAN part, in order to have exactly as in the United States, the possibility of increasing the power of radio LAN, having something like 1 watt, 4 watt EIRP for radio LAN outdoor. And that's precisely also to enable the use of this frequency band for some unlicensed vertical usage, whatever it's Wi-Fi, 5G, that we are technology neutral. So it's something which would be the first time in Europe that there would be an AFC or really dynamic sharing example. So it's a kind of step. And I know, in CBRS in the United States, it took a few years to come up successfully with all the mechanisms. So it will take time also in Europe for sure. We have also the dimension that we have 27 countries with different regulations. So it's bringing one additional dimension of complexity. So that's why for sure we will start being modest with only 2 tiers and just having to ensure the sharing between on one side the radio LAN and on the other side the fixed service, like in the United States, and also we'll take care of the uplink satellite by probably limiting the number of radio line being able to operate outdoor with 1 watt, 4 watt.
Absolutely. And so there, again, there's a lot of work going on, and here there is a question from Javier about AFCs and SAS can they be useful in facilitating higher power for local licensees? And let's talk a little bit about that, because power, it's a really crucial thing, but it's not necessarily, more power is not necessarily better. Because if you think about, say, 6 gigahertz, if you have the higher power you have, the least you tend to decrease the frequency reuse and increase the risk or the potential for interference with incumbent users. So there is a sense in which, especially for indoor coverage, having relatively low power enables an unlicensed approach, that if you want to have higher power, then you need to manage it with either a database or in other ways. So for instance, in the US, we have for the whole 6 gigahertz band in very low power indoor that doesn't require the AFC. You get the higher power, then yes, you have to manage it because you need to protect the incumbents. And so what is your view in terms of, what are the trade-offs there? Do we want to, especially as we go, like for instance, the millimeter wave and so on and so forth? I mean, should we just go for lower power and more unlicensed or higher frequency use, or especially from an enterprise point of view, do we need to go for higher power so that the spectrum becomes more valuable to the user in the sense that you have better propagation and all that? But then you need to have more of a database approach, or you need to manage it somehow.
Yeah, if I may, in fact, you have two different, say, competing issues. One is that with an AFC, you can improve the sharing possibilities, so you can increase the power. That's what I explained for the 6 gigahertz, lower 6 gigahertz. But as you mentioned, you have also the unlicensed aspect. If you have few stations being able to preempt the capacity in the old Paris, for example, you cannot anymore have some unlicensed usage because one user can preempt the capacity. So unlicensed, in a certain extent, is somewhat limited to something which is not, I don't know, 80 dBm EIRP. That's for sure. You mentioned also the higher frequency band, and it's true. For example, in the 60 gigahertz, our regulation in Europe is up to 55 dBm EIRP, which is quite powerful in terms of EIRP. But that's because the unlicensed or the sharing between all unlicensed users is made possible because of the directivity of antenna in this frequency band. So even if the EIRP is very high, you have in terms of interference potential quite limited interference potential. So that's why, yes, AFC can enable to increase the power, but up to a certain point because that's remaining unlicensed, at least for the 6 gigahertz.
I would answer the answer is yes and yes, and it's you're going to need both, and the idea that we're going to go forward and everything's going to go in this direction is unlikely in my mind. So you're going to need some cases and some bands where you're going to want higher frequency of sharing as you described, and in other bands you're going to want lower power. And you look at how the United States tried to deal with 6 gigahertz, not only the lower but the upper. And I would make the case that France should do the same on the upper, use unlicensed, but we'll see where they go. But I argue that you're going to still see this kind of three-tiered structure, not the three-tiered structure to CBRS, but the three-tiered structure, licensed, unlicensed, and sharing. And I don't think we're all going to merge those going forward. So you're still going to see, I'll tell you, CBRS, we wouldn't have where we are. We wouldn't be where we are in CBRS had we not cut some deals with, prime operators, so they would be able to use. The manufacturing community wasn't there, and we're still having a discussion over power limits on CBRS, and should we increase the power limits so you can deal with some of the use cases as you described. So that's an ongoing discussion in CBRS notwithstanding, and we'll have those periodically, I'm sure, going forward. So I imagine we're going to have more licensed spectrum is coming. We've done a ton on unlicensed spectrum. 6 gigahertz is a huge swath of unlicensed spectrum. And then I think we're going to have these plugins for CBRS-like structures, probably less complicated. And complication is not only about power, but it's also about money, right? Less complication means less money, easier entry. And I think that's where we're going. And I gave lower 37, probably in my mind, 3.1 to 3.45. The lower 3 gigahertz that is in the next couple of years is coming forward, I believe, in some capacity, and some of that's going to probably be in a CBRS-like model. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that money is an issue in a sense that a lot of the local licensing schemes, even if you have some payment, even if the payment is limited, it might still be a barrier to entry just because you have to register and pay whatever amount. And that's something that with CBRS in the US, if you use GIA, it's completely free. You need to register, but the registration is sort of taken care of. You don't have to send an application to the FCC or whatever. So there is registration and registration. And so I don't know whether you guys want to comment on. So the Ofcom in the UK has launched a consultation for use of the upper 6 gigahertz band, which would be something somewhat similar to, well, it's a sort of local licensing. So it's 6 gigahertz, which a lot of places it's unlicensed. So it is sort of unlicensed, but you have to register. So it's a sort of in between, and you have to pay. It's not a huge amount of money, but for some enterprises, it might be an issue, and it adds complication. Do you think that that's a good model? It's still not a dynamic model like CBRS. You either have it or you don't. I mean, you either use that band or you don't. So what do you think about it? That's kind of like, seems like a third way kind of.
Well, I think you have to put it in perspective. The real issue for Europe, for the upper 6 GHz, is this big debate on whether there should be a frequency band identified for IMT or frequency band which will be for Wi-Fi, like in the United States and in general all Americas, all region 2 in ITU, and that will be for WRC 23. So in my understanding, and of course that will be up to Ofcom to really clarify, but I think that that's what they did. The intention is more to say that well, is there's really a need for Wi-Fi in this upper 6 GHz in the short medium term before WRC 23 and all that. You may have access to this frequency band because this is possible, but they keep control of that by this kind of procedure. So this kind of procedure is more something which is enabling to change their mind or to align with European harmonization later after WRC 23 if this band is identified for IMT, if Europe is wishing to have IMT in this frequency band, more than something which is trying to be a kind of model, I don't know, in competition with CBRS or with any other model. I think it's very specific frequency band and issue.
Yeah. Mike, any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I haven't had time to fully digest it, but to me, it's a flavor of where we're going in this managed sharing approach, and I give them credit for being innovative. I'm suspected, but I appreciate that it's gone. It's an almost unlicensed structure, and I give them credit for that versus the licensing piece. I'd like to see 6 gigahertz for unlicensed spectrum globally. I think that's the better way to go, and we'll see what the leaders at WRC 23 are able to deliver. But then again, there's some bigger geopolitical issues on for the ITU and WRC that's for people to digest before we get there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I guess that if it's unlicensed, everybody can use it. So it's not just a Wi-Fi band. Now let's go to a question from Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer. So the question is, what are the challenges to implementing an automated approach to sharing in Europe? And I think that she's talking about the automated approach would be the SaaS approach for CBRS in the US, where you say, I want to use the band, and then the SaaS either says yes or no. It just gives you a grant. That's done on an automatic basis in real time, and so that's well, nobody has to, you just have your equipment register, and it either goes or it doesn't. But and there are multiple SaaSes, so there's not and as we talked about before, this is a model that we need in the US to make sure that incumbents had used. Is that a model that has any applicability or advantage in Europe? Eric, what do you think?
Well, yeah, that's CBRS and AFC. So I have responded about AFC. The difference between AFC and CBRS is basically that you have 3 tiers in CBRS. And if I can take an example, with this big difficulty in the upper 6 gigahertz, of course, this fight between IMT and Wi-Fi, many people have said, well, we just have to have a kind of CBRS in the upper 6 gigahertz with both unlicensed and IMT, I mean MNO in this frequency band. But when you are discussing to people, neither the IMT MNO community nor the Wi-Fi community is really wishing that. So certainly, if we would use this frequency band for MNO Wi-Fi, we would ask for kind of CBRS approach, and maybe the other way around. But at least from scratch, they want the frequency band for themselves and only for themselves. So I would tend to say that CBRS in the upper 60 GHz, which could be a potential solution, at least in theory, is not really supported, at least for the time being, by the stakeholders.
Okay, so the stakeholders, so I guess there is everybody wants to have for themselves in a traditional way, so either licensed or unlicensed, and they say, well, you know, let's make it sort of simple. That's you know, that's one way to look at it, but let's look at it from the enterprise point of view. So because we're talking about we've been looking up to now mostly from the sort of what is that you can do with the spectrum. But what is the enterprise want? So the very first question is, does the enterprise in the first place need anything more than unlicensed? I mean, up to now, every enterprise has Wi-Fi, and you know, the reason why a lot of time they are unhappy is because there's too much use in the Wi-Fi band. Not because Wi-Fi is an issue; it's just too successful in a way. So isn't just a way to just say, just give them more licensed spectrum and the enterprise is going to be happy? I'm just playing the devil's advocate here. Mike, you want to go?
I'll start and then look at. I'll start and say it depends on the enterprise. It depends on the function of you know, if you're talking about, you know, broadband or some type of access to the internet for an airport and for users, that's one thing. If you're talking about communications on the in an airport facility, that's different. If you're talking about a manufacturing site, I think it's different. I think that what a private network or you know, enterprise may need, you know, certain things, and why the license and the protections that it may need for the services that it wants to bring to its business, and the features and functions of what, you know, that vertical is. So I think it's a little bit different in many cases. And you know, a souped up Wi-Fi with some security, you know, features would be plenty. In other cases, licenses themselves are necessary, and would, you know, provide that security, provide the managing skills that needed for it. So I think it depends on the vertical that's being talked about.
And if I may, on that, I would fully agree with Mike that it's kind of case by case basis. For the different verticals, and I think it was mentioned by Mike at the beginning, you know, utilities and say big verticals which have a need for wide coverage may not dream about having a broadband or spectrum for broadband services individually for each utility. That's something which is now something impossible, and they will have to play with agreement with operators, access to MNO, maybe a secondary trading, and something which would be some local authorizations for some specific usages. There will be for them a kind of mix of authorization. Having said that, I wanted to respond to your question. For us, you know, with 3842 for local license and with the unlicensed possibilities, such as in the lower 60 GHz, that's already quite a nice possibility for a vertical deployment, and we would certainly wait to have some knowledge about the any potential additional need, but that's not totally sure. Having in mind also, and that was mentioned for the United States by Mike, that there are also millimetric wave where verticals may have also use of this frequency band, and there's something also in our SPG recommending to ensure possibility of access to local vertical in the 26 GHz or in the 40 GHz, so they will have also access to this frequency band. I just want to mention this week in France, we had a first experience to perform a fictive Earth operations using 5G. And obviously for that, they were obliged to use the 26 GHz because they need a large bunch of spectrum for ensuring the superposition of medical image with the surgery. So it's a good example of potential use of the 26 gigahertz for vertical.
Absolutely, and I guess, well, I guess that right now it's 5G, but you could use you know, it could be unlicensed and still 5G. So and I think that this is something to keep in mind, that 5G works everywhere. So potentially, I guess that you can say the same thing about Wi-Fi, but there's no Wi-Fi in 26 gigahertz yet. So
no, but you may have Wi-Fi in some millimetric wave at some point of time. That's for sure. I think the difference between 5G and Wi-Fi is the control of latency. When you are making Earth operation, you need to have a very good latency, and that's probably here for this particular example the advantage of 5G, even if Wi-Fi is also trying to improve the latency performance.
Yeah, well, I mean, you got 6 gigahertz. That's a lot of spectrum for Wi-Fi in many countries. And well, I mean, if you don't have a huge amount of traffic in the band, then latency is not much of an issue with Wi-Fi. So, you know, that's you know, that's why, you know, the way I think about it is that, you know, like with CBRS and 6 gigahertz in the US and with the local licensing and 6 gigahertz in Europe, is that you really need both, because you know, if you look at the lower band, you just have so much spectrum. There's just so much capacity. But for some applications, you really need it in some verticals. So, you know, as you mentioned, utilities, it's a good case where you do need to have the reliability and the reach that you only can get in sub 6 gigahertz. But that's not all you need. So you just need to have the two of them. And so from an enterprise point of view, we need to understand what are their needs. And utilities is a special case. Airports are another case. And also, it's not just enterprises, it's also cities, universities, or other educational institutions. So how do we think about those different uses? I mean, users, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's a difficult, you know, you can't, as we tackle the issue as we started, you know, I don't think you're going to have spectrum dedicated for particular segments of enterprises. I don't think I think we're moving far away from that. And you're providing, you know, as broad of different, you know, flavor of opportunities as we go forward, and what the enterprises are going to use both, you know, spectrum, whether it be unlicensed or licensed or the sharing model, they're going to use it, you know, in the best circumstances. I also see where, you know, operators are going to be involved in many cases, and in some cases they won't be. I mean, there's going to be, you know, it's going to be a constantly moving, you know, structure. And I'm not sure there's, you know, an ability to deal with one, you know, the enterprises are all different flavors, and, you know, my little company is different than someone else's. And so there is no, you know, way to think about it. I think the verticals are, you know, are you know, categories are, you know, can be, you know, somewhat grouped together. And I do think it's different what an airport needs and a manufacturing site. I mean, I think those are different, but how they are addressed may not necessarily be different.
Same response from my side. I mean, on that, US and Europe are exactly the same. We have different enterprise, different utilities, and the ways they would mix between MNOs, secondary trading, local authorizations, and unlicensed usage is really particular to their specific need.
Yeah, so I see a comment here about utility on Wi-Fi. This in the 5 gigahertz band is not really constrained by it being overcrowded. And it's more about technical constraints. I didn't want to say that there's no utility. I mean, it's a Wi-Fi and 5 gigahertz. It's excellent. It's just that when you get to a point where you have so much traffic, clearly performance is affected, and so you need more spectrum. Which is not to say there's any, you know, it's just like that would be true of well, that is true in fact of licensed spectrum too. When you have too many users, then obviously you need to kick someone out. So that's sort of a physics thing. It's regardless of technology. Obviously in a licensed band you can manage it in a different way, but capacity is always an issue, isn't it? So now you mentioned the secondary market, and that's something that it has not really worked as much as it could. I think there's a huge amount of potential there, but we have not really explored it or used it as much. But then when you look at countries like in China, for instance, the enterprise networks there tend to be more, basically, it's not a secondary market, but they're basically managed by the mobile operators, because there is nothing like the equivalent of CBRS or local share or local licensing. So if you're an enterprise, you need licensed sort of deterministic behavior, and you don't want to use unlicensed band. You need to work with an operator, and that has worked much better than in the West. Is there something that should we try to encourage more that kind of model or not? And when I talk to enterprises, my impression is that they want to have control over the network, and so they are kind of like, and this is especially true, I would say, in the US, where the enterprise says, well, I'm going to spend the money, it's my thing. And so the secondary market is going to be a little bit more of a tricky proposition because of this kind of attitude. You want to have your own. And so what do you think? Is it the secondary market? Is that going to go anywhere within Europe, North America, and other advanced markets? Or should we just go more for like the CBRS and local sharing for the enterprise?
It's a useful tool. Anyway, I mean, you mentioned clearly that some verticals may have very specific need. Now with the local authorizations framework, they will have the possibility to respond to their very specific need. If they need something which is for wider coverage, of course, they will have to manage with your operators, whatever is through spectrum trading or through the possibility to use to have a contract with your operator. One interesting example is PPDR. With PPDR, you may have one PPDR say operator, PPDR operator, having an agreement with MNO to get access to the MNO services, and at some point of time, if you have some disaster, for example, this PPDR operator may need to have more spectrum, because they will need this more spectrum for the specific time when there are such a disaster. And in this kind of circumstances, you will have a good use of secondary trading. But when you say encouraging secondary trading, what exactly is the tools that a regulator would have for that? I mean, regulation is here, it's open in all Europe. Secondary trading is possible, and then that's for the different stakeholders to use this tool to ensure the most appropriate response to the vertical needs.
So I guess the fact that people don't use it much maybe is because there's not much of a demand from the enterprises or willingness from the operator to open it to,
Vertical are not so much using for the time being 5G and spectrum. That's starting, and that's also why there's this local authorization regime which is put in place. But then when they will have also this possibility and also having control for certain sites, which would be essential for themselves, they will certainly see interest in extending that possibilities, either through a contract with MNO, because that's still a possibility, and contract can also include some elements such as reliability that we mentioned, and obviously secondary trading is one other option.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would answer the question, say secondary markets in some places, certainly the operator side work fairly well. On the non-operators, the secondary market has been tough. The operators, if you're talking about disaggregation of licenses or any kind of other capacity, you're really having a difficulty making that work. And I think what happens is you make the network smaller. I think you're going to see where AI plays a good role in this. I think eventually, reducing the transaction costs and the functionality of making a secondary market transaction, I think that's going to become easier and more automated, and therefore that just like the SaaSes can change on and off, so will be the transactions to be smoother, rather than it's just a really difficult time. And you only have to look back a couple of years on like positive train control, and the ability for like Amtrak and some of the train systems to obtain licensing for a particular safety system that became very, bureaucratic and difficult to, a very small segment of 222 they were looking for. So I take that the secondary market still hasn't fully developed and will over time, but it's now not as functional, except for the operator side, and even that has problems outside M&O, outside M&A kind of scenarios.
Okay, so I'm looking at the questions coming in. There's another question, two things on Wi-Fi. There was the thing about mentioning too much traffic in Wi-Fi. This might be true of 2.4 gigahertz, but not generally of 5 gigahertz. We could do better engineering interference mitigation techniques in 5 gigahertz. Yes, that is true. But if you go like in places like airports or stadiums, there's just a lot of traffic. Congestion is an issue. And again, it's nothing to do with the technology. And clearly, yes, you can mitigate interference more effectively. But when you have multiple users, clearly it becomes a little bit more challenging. Not because, I'm the biggest proponent of Wi-Fi. I'm just, realistically, that is the success of the technology. You have many users and they don't necessarily coordinate. They're not all using the same engineering mitigation techniques. Now they're not available. It's just that, in fact, they might not be used. But then
if I may, Monica, it's more a question to Martin on that, because one is speaking about better engineered interference mitigation techniques in the 5 gigahertz. Does he mention something like an AFC in the 5 gigahertz in replacement with the DFS, which may be also of interest for the say incumbent governmental users of the frequency band? Everybody know that there are a lot of interference to radars due to some malfunctioning of some radio LAN equipment. So that may be a kind of win-win situation, but it would take some time and some studies to be able to make this kind of refarming of the mitigation technique.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. And so Bob Friday asked a question about one of keys to Wi-Fi success was to getting a common global unlicensed spectrum regulations. Do you think we can get to global standards for shared spectrum regulations optimized for 3GPP cellular? Well, I think that there is the whole 5G NRU, but it doesn't seem to have as much traction as Wi-Fi, because yeah, you can use it, but I don't see that really picking up as much as it could. I don't know. What do you guys think about it?
It's all going to happen with time. It's all going to materialize, and we're getting there. It's people think it's slowly developing. I think it's where we are based on this time. It's amazing, and how much progress we've made. And I think with release 17 and release 18 and 3GPP, I think we're only going to see new, really dynamic universes in the 5G space. And as where we go, the same situation in the sharing regime. And in 10 years from now, I think we're going to have look nothing like it is today.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. So we have another question. Illegal airline equipment is not justification for AFC at 5 gigahertz. I don't think that anybody is proposing an AFC at 5 gigahertz, right? Or am I?
Oh, yeah, it's just what I mentioned, because I was not sure to understand what is a better engineering interference mitigation techniques. The DFS is designed to protect radars, and I don't think anybody is trying to change that. The problem is that you have also illegal equipment which are creating interference to radars. And my questions to Martin was to say, well, if you want to change to have better engineering interference mitigation, could it be something like an AFC for the 5 years? Because in this case, you may improve the situations in terms of better engineering interference mitigation techniques, and at the same time, maybe have better interference mitigation, since radars would not be interfered in this case by these radio LAN equipments, which are deactivating, for example, DFS in order to avoid this interference constraint.
Yeah, so apologies, Mike had to go, but we had him for the whole hour. So so sorry about that. But okay, so we are almost about to close. So maybe Eric, can you give us some parting thoughts of how do you see the path to giving the enterprise the spectrum they need from either European or worldwide? What do you what are the major challenges? What are the opportunities there?
Well, they need spectrum to be able to operate in local area license usage, and that's what we will open in Europe in the year 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz, and what we started to open in France in the 3.8 to 4 gigahertz. And they need to have some unlicensed spectrum, which is better suited to the need by enabling outdoor operations and higher power. And that's what we are trying to do in the lower 6 gigahertz in Europe. At least France is trying to do that by implementing AFC, so with a sharing scheme. With that, and of course, together with the millimetric wave, I think that the vertical industry, we have a nice, say, portfolio of spectrum and possibility authorization available to meet their own requirement.
Excellent. I think we're at the top of the hour, and so we need to get going. But Eric, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us, and thank all of you in the audience. Kendra,
Thanks all. Thanks, Monica.
Okay, great. Well, that will conclude our webinar for today. Thanks again to our speakers for that great conversation, and thanks to our audience members for those wonderful questions. A recorded version of this webinar will be available at senzafili.com in the coming days. And just a quick reminder that this was done in partnership with Forum Global's 17th European Spectrum Management Conference, which will be held in Brussels next month. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.